In 2006, climbers on Mount Everest passed a man named David Sharp huddled in a limestone alcove near the summit, barely moving. He was sitting next to the frozen body of another climber who had died there a decade earlier. More than 40 people passed him. Some stopped briefly. Most didn't. He died there. That story made global headlines. People were outraged. How could trained mountaineers walk past a dying man? But here's the thing almost every article missed. David Sharp was likely already unreachable in every way that matters, not dead yet technically. But by the time most of those climbers encountered him, the oxygen deprivation and cold had probably stripped away rational thought, self-preservation, even the ability to ask for help, one system at a time. Based on what we know about how the brain responds under those conditions, it's reasonable to infer that by the time he stopped moving, he was no longer experiencing what we'd recognize as conscious suffering. That's what dying in extreme environments actually does to you. It doesn't look like the movies. It doesn't feel the way you'd expect. And in some cases, your own body, your own brain, will betray you in ways that are almost impossible to believe until you see the science behind it. Today we're going inside 4 of the most extreme death scenarios on Earth: the freezing cold, the scorching heat, crushing altitude, and the open ocean. What your body experiences, what your mind does, and why the human instinct to survive can, in the final moments, turn completely against you. Let's start with cold, because most people think they understand it. You get cold, you shiver, you lose feeling, you fall asleep peacefully. It's supposed to be a gentle way to go. That's not really what happens. The first stage of hypothermia, defined medically as a core body temperature dropping below 95 degrees, hits you with something your brain interprets as a manageable problem. You shiver uncontrollably. Your blood vessels clamp down, pulling warmth away from your fingers and toes and arms and legs, funneling it toward your vital organs. It's a sacrifice move. Your body is essentially deciding what it can afford to lose. At this point, you know something is wrong. You feel it. But you're still thinking clearly enough to recognize the danger. Then something changes. As your core temperature continues to drop into the mid-80s Fahrenheit, the shivering stops. That's not a good sign. Shivering is your body's furnace. When it stops, it means the furnace has run out of fuel. Confusion sets in. Your movements slow. A researcher studying cold water immersion found that when people are plunged into freezing seas without protection, around 20% die within the first 2 minutes, not from hypothermia itself, but from cold shock. The gasp reflex kicks in, water floods the lungs, and the heart can give out from the sudden cardiovascular surge. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. For those who slip deeper into hypothermia, something medically documented and still not fully understood begins to happen. The muscles that have been fighting to keep blood vessels constricted, to lock all that warm blood near the core, they get exhausted. They give up. And when they do, blood rushes outward to the extremities in one sudden wave. The result? A feeling of warmth so convincing, so absolute, that the dying person believes the cold is lifting. A 1995 forensic study by Rothschild and Schneider examined 69 fatal hypothermia cases at a German institute between 1978 and 1994 and found that paradoxical undressing, victims removing their own clothing, occurred in about 25% of cases, not in confusion, not randomly, but in a way that looked, from the physical evidence, entirely deliberate. The researchers described it as the result of peripheral blood vessels suddenly dilating, producing a genuine sensation of heat. Forensic investigators have repeatedly mistaken these scenes for something criminal. Victims found partially or fully undressed in sub-freezing temperatures, apparently by choice. Given that rational thought is severely impaired by this stage of hypothermia, the implication is that this isn't a decision at all. It's the body misfiring. The phenomenon is called paradoxical undressing. And it gets stranger, because the same 1995 study found that nearly all the victims who'd undressed were also found in an unusual position. They had crawled into small, enclosed spaces, under beds, behind wardrobes, in closets. The researchers described it as an autonomous process of the brainstem, triggered in the final stage of hypothermia, producing what they called terminal burrowing behavior, a primitive, hibernation-like response to threat. They noted it predominantly occurred when temperature dropped slowly, suggesting it may reflect a kind of ancient thermoregulatory reflex the brain runs as a last resort. That is how you die of cold, not gently, not simply. Your brain's most ancient survival programming running on fumes, making you do things that look, from the outside, completely inexplicable, because by that point, the part of the brain that could explain them is long gone. Now flip the dial. Heat is a quietly growing killer. A 2025 study published in JAMA Network Open, the most comprehensive analysis of its kind, covering over 54 million U.S. death records across 2 decades, found that while cold-related deaths still outpace heat deaths in raw numbers, deaths linked to high temperatures surged by 53% between 2009 and 2010-2020. The pace of that rise is what alarms researchers. Heat deaths went from around 2,670 per year in the first decade to over 4,000 per year in the second. And yet heat death is systematically undercounted because almost no one has heat listed as a direct cause of death on their certificate. They die of heart failure, kidney failure, stroke. The heat starts the cascade, but it disappears in the paperwork. So what does it actually feel like? Early stage, you sweat. Your blood vessels dilate near the skin, trying to radiate heat outward. Your heart rate climbs. You feel tired. Your head begins to pound. That's the blood pressure fluctuating as your cardiovascular system tries to manage 2 competing demands at once: cool the skin and supply the organs. Then the sweating starts to matter less. In dry heat, sweat evaporates fast, which is why people can survive longer in arid deserts than in humid ones. In humid conditions, the sweat just sits there, your body's primary cooling mechanism functionally disabled. At a core temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, you've crossed into heat stroke territory. Below that line is heat exhaustion, serious but survivable. Above it, your central nervous system begins to fail. The distinguishing clinical feature isn't just temperature, it's a change in mental status, confusion, disorientation, sometimes seizures. And notably, the skin often stops sweating entirely at this stage, even as the body continues to overheat. The cooling system doesn't just struggle, it shuts down. What's happening internally is a full systemic emergency. The intestinal lining, normally a tight barrier, begins to break down. Bacterial toxins from the gut can leak into the bloodstream. The liver starts to falter. The kidneys lose the ability to filter. Muscle tissue breaks down in a process called rhabdomyolysis, releasing proteins that further damage the kidneys. Heat stroke can affect almost every organ simultaneously. That's what makes it so lethal so fast. The subjective experience of severe heat stroke from those who survived is often described not as pain but as a narrowing, a sense that the world is collapsing inward, that you can't quite grip your own thoughts. One moment you know you need water, need shade, need help, then that knowledge slides out of reach before you can act on it. The brain is among the earliest casualties of heat stroke, and based on survivor accounts, it tends to go quietly, not with alarm, but with a fog that thickens so gradually you don't notice you've stopped being able to think straight until you can't. Which brings us back to Everest, and to the place where all of this gets genuinely haunting. Above 8,000 meters, roughly 26,000 feet, is what mountaineers call the death zone. The name is not dramatic, it's physiological. At this altitude, oxygen partial pressure is less than a third of its value at sea level. The body uses oxygen faster than it can replace it. Even with supplemental oxygen, the margins are razor thin. In 2009, a team of UCL doctors published a landmark study in the New England Journal of Medicine based on direct blood measurements taken near the summit of Everest during the 2007 Caldwell Extreme Everest Expedition. They drew arterial blood from climbers just below the summit at 8,400 meters after those climbers had been breathing ambient air for 20 minutes and found average arterial oxygen levels of 3.28 kilopascals. The normal human range is 12 to 14 kilopascal. Patients in intensive care are considered critically ill below 8 kilopascal. The study's authors described these as among the lowest oxygen levels ever documented in living humans. Those people were still walking, still climbing. Their blood was running at levels that, in any hospital in the world, would indicate imminent organ failure. What the altitude does mechanically is starve the brain. And when the brain starves, rational thought doesn't just decline, it warps. In the death zone, climbers have been documented forgetting to clip their safety ropes, misreading routes, deciding it's fine to sit down for a few minutes, and never getting up. Exhaustion and oxygen deprivation are physiologically indistinguishable from each other at that altitude. Both deliver the same signal. Rest will solve this. It won't. The two killers at extreme altitude are high-altitude pulmonary edema, where fluid fills the lungs, and high-altitude cerebral edema, where the brain itself swells against the inside of a fixed-volume skull. HACE follows a documented progression: confusion, then loss of coordination, then unconsciousness. What happens inside the skull in those final stages, whether there is awareness, whether there is fear, is something we can only infer from those who caught the condition early enough to be rescued. From what those survivors describe, the onset of confusion feels, from the inside, like ordinary tiredness. There's no alarm bell. The worsening looks, to the person experiencing it, like it isn't worsening. David Sharp almost certainly experienced something like this. In the hours before he stopped moving, his oxygen supply had run out. The cold had been working on him for an unknown stretch of time, and his cognitive function, whatever remained of it, was being dismantled by both forces simultaneously. The possibility that he was simply waiting, aware but unable to ask for help, is one that troubled everyone who passed him. What's more likely, given the physiology, is that by that point, the awareness was already gone. There are currently over 200 bodies still on Mount Everest, most preserved by the cold. For years, one of them, believed to be Indian climber Sewang Palger, known simply as Green Boots, served as a grim mileage marker on the north route, his body still curled in the hollow where he had stopped to rest during a 1996 storm. He stopped to rest because stopping to rest, at that altitude, with a brain starved of oxygen, felt like the right call. The ocean kills differently. Cold water conducts heat away from the body approximately 25 times faster than air at the same temperature, which means that in water below 59 degrees Celsius, and much of the world's water sits well below that, the first thing that happens, within seconds, is cold shock. The gasp reflex. Involuntary, uncontrollable, essentially impossible to override through willpower alone. Your lungs expand suddenly, your heart rate spikes, blood pressure surges. If your face is underwater when this reflex fires, you inhale water, and that alone can be fatal within minutes. It's estimated that roughly 20% of cold water immersion deaths happen in the first 2 minutes from this mechanism alone, not from cold, not from drowning in the traditional sense, but from the body's initial alarm response going catastrophically wrong. If you survive cold shock, the clock doesn't stop. Within 15 to 30 minutes in truly cold water, what researchers call cold incapacitation sets in. This isn't hypothermia yet, the core temperature hasn't dropped significantly, but the arms and legs stop working, not because they're simply numb, because the body has actively redirected blood flow away from them to protect the core. The muscles are being deliberately starved. You can be fully conscious, completely aware, watching yourself lose function limb by limb. That's the cruelest part, the awareness without capacity, knowing precisely what's happening, being unable to change it. Without flotation, even a strong swimmer in water below about 59 degrees will likely become incapacitated before hypothermia ever sets in, with estimates from cold water safety researchers suggesting swimming failure within roughly 30 minutes in severe cold, though this varies significantly by individual, clothing, and water temperature. Hypothermia, the condition most people associate with cold water death, actually only accounts for roughly 15% of cold immersion fatalities. Cold shock and incapacitation together claim the majority. And then there's one more stage almost no one talks about: circumrescue collapse. Shortly before, during, or even hours after rescue, survivors of cold immersion can suddenly go into cardiac arrest. The act of being pulled out of the water, sitting up, warming too quickly, each can trigger a collapse the body managed to avoid while still in the water. Cold water survival experts often describe it as the body holding together just long enough to reach help, then releasing everything at once. What makes all of this so unsettling isn't the physical mechanics of it. It's the consistent pattern across every environment. The loss of self-awareness preceding death. The moment where a person stops knowing how bad it is. In hypothermia, it's the warmth that isn't there. In heat stroke, it's the fog that feels, from inside, like nothing unusual. At extreme altitude, it's the tiredness that has no alarm attached to it. In cold water, it's the strange peace some survivors describe settling in just before incapacitation becomes complete. In each case, the body is doing something that, looked at from the outside, seems almost protective. Not lying, exactly, just withholding the full picture. David Sharp, frozen in that cave on Everest, almost certainly didn't experience the end the way we might imagine it from the outside, as a desperate conscious struggle. Based on what we know about oxygen deprivation and hypothermia acting together, the window for coherent awareness had likely already closed long before he lost the ability to move. Whether that's a comfort is probably a question each person has to answer for themselves. What seems clear is that extreme environments don't just kill the body, they disassemble the person first, quietly, in a sequence evolution never prepared us to recognize from inside. And the most important thing to take from this isn't about death at all, it's about the window before it. Every single process described here has a reversal point, a moment where descent saves a climber, where shade in water pulls someone back from heat stroke, where a life jacket keeps a drowning person afloat long enough for help to arrive. The body fights hard to keep you here. Understanding exactly how it fights and where it starts to fail is as close to a survival manual as the science can offer.